Today is the 22nd Sunday after Pentecost, and the epistle is taken from St. Paul's epistle to the Philippians. Brethren, I'm confident that he who has inspired this generosity in you will bring it to perfection, ready for the day when Jesus Christ comes. It is only fitting that I should entertain such expectations for you are close to my heart, and I know that you all share my happiness in being a prisoner and being able to defend and to assert the truth of the gospel. God knows how I long for all of you with the tenderness of Jesus Christ himself, and this is my prayer for you. May your love grow richer and richer in the fullness of its knowledge and in the depth of its perception, so that you may learn to prize that which is of value. May nothing cloud your conscience or hinder your progress to the day when Christ comes. May you reap through Jesus Christ the full harvest of your justification to God's glory and praise. Please stand for the Holy Gospel. The Gospel reading is taken from the Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew. At that time, the Pharisees withdrew, and they plotted together with the Herodians to make Jesus betray himself in his speech. And so they sent their own disciples to Jesus, along with those who were of Herod's party. And they said, Master, we know well that thou art sincere, and that thou teachest in all sincerity the way of God, that thou holdest no one in awe, making no distinction between one man and another. Tell us then, is it right to pay tribute to Caesar or not? Jesus saw their malice, and he said to them, Hypocrites, why do you thus put me to the test? Show me the coinage in which the tribute is paid. So they brought him a silver piece, and he asked them, Whose likeness is this imprinted upon the coin? Caesar's, they answered. Whereupon Jesus answered, Why then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. This is the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. We have some announcements. The Mass is offered for the repose of Kenneth Aragon Jr. The second offering today is for St. Patrick's Seminary. The Culture Project, a group of lay missionaries invited by the Archbishop, will be speaking on Sunday at 11 a.m. in the St. Francis Room on sexual integrity. All middle school and high school students and their parents are welcome. The Knights of Columbus are sponsoring an Oktoberfest celebration next Saturday, November 11th, after the 4:30 Mass. Sean Bryan, also known as the Papal Ninja, will be the next speaker in our speaker series on Sunday, and this will be November 12th at 6 p.m. Our annual upcoming Thanksgiving drive is in honor of Thomas Hooker, the homeless man who left a legacy of kindness to all of us here in the inner Richmond. Let us fill up 3 barrels with gifts of food, which will benefit St. Anthony's and the Tenderloin and the Missionaries of Charity. All this for the homeless. Details on these events can be found in the bulletin available at the doors of the church. Now, the question that the Pharisees and the Herodians put to Jesus in today's gospel concerns the application of the virtue of justice to the matter of paying the toll tax imposed upon the Jews by the Romans under Caesar Augustus. Our Lord is being asked here whether or not the Jews are morally obliged under the requirements of justice to pay the tax. So this is a good time to review, I think, the patristic and scholastic position on justice. St. Thomas Aquinas defines justice as a lasting and constant habit of will, a habit which consists in the deliberate intention to always render to each one what is his rightful and proper due. The seat of justice, the faculty with which justice is most concerned, is the will, especially in the actions of consent, intention, and choice. Now, the norm and standard and rule of just action is the objective and true order of mutual rights and obligations established and ordained by God and made manifest in His creation. Now, when I say that this order of rights and duties is objective, what I mean is that it is independent of our minds. It's extramental. It's outside. It's an ontological order, not constructed by our minds, but rather discovered by our minds. This objective order of rights and obligations that ought to be maintained in dealings among persons can be easily discerned by right reason as part of the natural law. Moreover, the virtue of justice simply requires that in our interpersonal reactions we conform to this objective order of mutual rights and obligations. The scholastics, following the fathers of the Church, define three basic classes of justice. First, there is communicative justice, then distributive justice, and then a subset of these two, which is called legal justice. Now, communicative justice is the justice which governs the exchange of rights and duties between individuals or parties that are equal in their mutual dealings with each other. In other words, communicative justice demands strict equality of value in the goods exchanged or transferred from one person to another. Equal value, as in buying and selling, should be exchanged. Now that, of course, is a general rule. And each sort of justice has its own general rule or norm or standard or law. And these general rules must be applied to each particular individual case. But these general rules must always be applied in such a way that the general rule is observed and is kept intact. Not the way that Francis deals with general rules. From his point of view, as we see in Amoris Laetitia, the general rule is simply ignored, or worse, negated in the process of applying it to individual cases. And that, of course, will not work. The individual rule must be observed, as I said, and kept intact when it is applied to individual cases. The other form of justice, or another form of justice, is distributive justice. Now, distributive justice governs the distribution or handing out of the common stock or wealth of the community to the members of the community. In other words, distributive justice is the apportioning to each member of the community of his due and rightful share of the community wealth. Now, of course, the dispensing of community goods is generally performed by the civil government, which is assumed to function as the guardian of the common good. And the rule here that governs distributive justice is that the resources of the community must be distributed to the members of the community in a manner proportionate to each member's merit, capacity, services, and needs. And since these factors will differ among different members of the community, it follows that the distribution of goods will be varied and will be unequal. Now, there's one more form of justice that we want to talk about, and that is legal justice. And this is the form of justice that governs the return of goods to the community by its members. In other words, legal justice is the justice due to the civil community, taken as a whole and represented by the civil government. It is to be paid by the individual members of the civil community. So the payment of taxes, of course, is an obligation that pertains in the category of legal justice. And the question placed before Jesus in this morning's gospel concerns the matter of the moral obligation involved in the payment of a particular tax. Now, the general overarching argument that supports the right of the civil government to impose taxes is very simple. The state, from the natural law, has the right to the means necessary to accomplish its end, which is the common good of the whole community. But one of the means necessary to attain this end is revenue. But the ordinary way of collecting revenue is by way of taxation. Therefore, it's argued that the state has the right to tax its citizens. But the virtue of justice imposes limitations, conditions, and restrictions upon the right of the state or the civil authority to tax its citizens. And these limitations are very much relevant to this morning's gospel, or this evening's gospel. First of all, the civil authority has the right only to the tax revenue that it needs in order to properly serve the common good of the members of the community. To demand more than that is a violation of justice. Second, the state has the obligation to distribute the tax load in a manner that is proportionate to each citizen's ability to pay. There will, of course, be citizens who cannot afford to pay taxes, and they will rather need help from the government. And it's also the unanimous opinion of the fathers and the scholastics of the church, particularly emphasized by St. Thomas Aquinas, but among the fathers very much emphasized by Saints Hilary and St. Basil, that the care of those dispossessed and poor citizens is clearly the obligation of the state under the virtue of justice. It's not a question of charity, it's a question of justice in the strictest sense. And the state also, of course, in order to have a right to impose taxes, must be a legitimately constituted, legally formed regime that holds its power by right and not by way of usurpation. And finally, the laws that the state enforces must always be right and morally good, since the state uses the tax revenue that it collects to impose and to enforce these laws. In other words, the use or purpose to which the civil government puts these revenues it collects, must be right and morally good, must be a right use and a morally good use. If these conditions are not fulfilled, then the citizens, the members of the community, have no moral obligation whatsoever to pay tax to the civil government. Under such circumstances, the payment of taxes becomes what we call a purely penal obligation. In other words, it's not a moral obligation and has no moral force whatsoever, but if you do not pay your taxes, you're very likely to be punished, a purely penal obligation. And so in today's gospel, the question is put before our Lord, "Teacher, is it lawful, or does justice require that we pay the tax to the emperor or not?" Now, the two groups who come together here to put this question to Jesus are two groups who are normally hostile to each other, and they represent mutually contradictory positions regarding the obligation to pay this particular tax. The Herodians maintained that Rome's rule in its occupation of Palestine was legitimate, and therefore the Jews had a duty under the virtue of justice to pay the tax. The Herodians were loyal to King Herod, and King Herod, of course, had been appointed by Rome as king of Judea. And Herod, who was entirely beholden to Rome for all his power, endorsed the tax and enforced it. On the other hand, the Pharisees, who were Jewish nationalists, rejected and repudiated the Roman rule of Palestine. They saw it as an illegal usurpation accomplished through invasion and conquest. And they argued that the Jews had no moral right whatsoever, no moral duty whatsoever, to pay the tax. Some Pharisees counseled, in fact, that non-payment of taxes was a very, very effective form of passive resistance. Other Pharisees, from a practical standpoint, argued that it was a morally safer course to pay the tax rather than to suffer the severe reprisals that the refusal to pay might bring upon oneself and upon others. The point is that whichever way Jesus answered the question, he was bound to antagonize one of the two groups. And if he flat out said, "Do not pay the tax," the Herodians would almost certainly hand him over to Rome and denounce him as a traitor. So this is the classic dilemma situation. No matter which way you turn, you run into trouble. You'll note here that our Lord simply refuses to step into the trap that his enemies have set for him. Rather than becoming involved in messy arguments and antagonistic disputes, he responds to them simply by stating a universal, fundamental principle mandated in all cases by the virtue of justice, namely, give to each person what is his rightful due. Our Lord replies to them, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's." Now note that Christ does not say what belongs to Caesar. He merely gets his enemies to state that the inscription and the image on the coin are Caesar's. But he does not say that the tax should be paid and that the coin therefore belongs to Caesar. Nor does Jesus advise them either to pay or not to pay the tax. And then in the very next line, the concluding line of the gospel this evening, Jesus moves the entire discussion from the socio-political sphere to the religious sphere. He says to them, "Render unto God the things that are God." Render unto God the things that belong to God. So Jesus here doesn't tell us what it is that belongs to God, but in the book of Deuteronomy we read, "Heaven and earth and all that is in them belong to the Lord your God." So Jesus ends this discussion, which began as a socio-political issue. He ends this discussion by reminding us of the most fundamental, the most basic, the most elementary, the most primary rule of justice. And that is to make a return to God of ourselves and of everything with which we come into contact. In other words, every human action should advance us ad unum et ad Deum, towards unity with God. Only in this way can we give God what is God's proper due: our worship, our love, and our service.